she came off the afternoon stage into a wind that smelled of dust and dry cattle, carrying a single brown valise and a leather riding case held tight against her chest. And the men loafing outside the freight office took the quietness in her face for the timidity of a woman who had come a long way to be disappointed. It was not timidity. Adeline Vance had buried more in the last 2 years than most people lose in a lifetime, and she had not crossed half a country to stand in the heat of a town she had never heard of and be afraid of a few idle men. Josiah Calder had written away for a wife the way another man writes away for a clerk, because the books of his ranch had gotten beyond one tired man's reckoning, and because the house had gone cruelly silent since the diphtheria took his brother and his brother's wife in the same hard week, and a man can only sit so long with a ledger he is afraid to open. He wanted someone plain and sensible who could keep his accounts and ask him nothing. He expected to be let down, the way he had come to expect it of nearly everything. What Josiah Calder did not know, standing at the edge of the boardwalk with his hat in his sunburned hands and his cattle spread, sliding quietly toward the bank's column of red ink, was that the woman climbing down from that stage carried, folded inside that worn writing case, a recorded deed to the very water and the very grass his creditors were already counting as good as theirs. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. It was May of 1883, in the short grass country of the Nebraska Panhandle, in a sun-bleached cattle town called Harlow Bend, and the afternoon stage had just set down the only person who could save Josiah Calder, though neither of them would have believed it if you had told them so. The town sat in a shallow bend of a creek that had been generous once and had lately learned to be stingy. There was a single rutted street, a bank with a false front grander than the building behind it, a mercantile, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a scattering of houses that had all weathered to the same gray as the prairie around them. The stage had come in from the railhead 40 miles east, and 40 miles is a long way to be jostled with your knees against a stranger's. And Adeline Vance was glad to set her boots on ground that did not move. She stood a moment beside her valleys and let the wind take the travel out of her, and she looked at the town the way a person looks at a thing she means to understand rather than a thing she means to admire. She was 27 years old, slim and straight-backed, with dark hair pinned up under a plain straw bonnet and a face that gave away very little, and the leather case she held against her was the one possession she had carried through every hard mile of the last 2 years without once letting it out of her sight. A man came toward her along the boardwalk, and she knew him before he spoke, because he carried himself like a man walking to a thing he dreaded. He was tall and weathered, perhaps 34 or 35, with a few days of dark beard and eyes the gray of a winter sky, and his shirt had been mended at the elbow by a hand that had not much cared whether the stitches showed. He stopped a careful distance from her and turned his hat once in his hands. "You'd be the Vance woman," he said. It was not quite a question. "I would," she said. "And you'd be Mr. Calder, Josiah Calder." He looked at her, and then he looked at her valise, and then he looked at the leather case she held, and something in his face decided she would do, and decided also not to expect much of her. "I figured you'd be older. I figured you'd be friendlier," she said evenly, and a man down the boardwalk laughed once before he caught himself, and Josiah Calder's jaw tightened. And that was the first thing that ever passed between them. Not warmth, not even quite civility, but a kind of plain, leveling honesty that he had not braced for and did not know what to do with. "I've got the wagon," he said after a moment. "It's a fair piece out to the place. We'd best get on if you mean to see it in daylight." He reached for her valise, and she let him take it, but when his hand went toward the leather case, she turned, smooth and unhurried, so that the case stayed against her chest, and she said, "I'll keep this one," in a voice that left no edge to argue against. He looked at her a half-second longer than was polite, and then he decided, the way a tired man decides most things, that it was not worth the asking. He carried the valise to a buckboard waiting in the shade of the livery, and he handed her up onto the bench with a stiff correctness that was the closest thing to courtesy he seemed to own, and they rode out of Harlow Bend with the sun pushing long and gold across the short grass and the wind never once letting up. He did not talk, and she did not press him to. She watched the country instead, and the country told her a great deal. She saw grass that had been grazed hard and not given time to come back, and she saw the bleached bones of a steer in a draw, and she saw a windmill standing motionless with two of its blades hanging broken, and she read all of it the way another woman might read a letter. She had been raised by a father who taught her that land speaks plainly to anyone who will trouble to learn its language, and she had learned it young, and she had never unlearned it through all the years that came after. Josiah Calder beside her saw only the road and his own dark thoughts, and so he did not notice that his hired wife was taking the full measure of his ruin before they had so much as come in sight of his door. They came over a low rise an hour out, and the ranch lay below them in the last of the light. It was not much. A low timber house gone gray, a barn with a sag in its ridgeline, a corral, a scatter of outbuildings, and beyond them the long brown roll of the range running off to a line of bluffs in the west. A creek bent through it, low and slow, with a green ribbon of grass along its banks that was the only truly living color in the whole tired scene. A few cattle stood along the water. A thin thread of smoke came up from the house chimney, which meant someone was inside, and Adeline filed that away too. "It's bigger than the bank thinks it is," she said, almost to herself, looking down at the spread. He turned and looked at her then, sharp, the first time he had really looked at her since the boardwalk. "What do you know about what the bank thinks?" he said. It was not a friendly thing to say. "Nothing yet," she answered. "I only know the look of a man who's been to see one lately. You've got it." And she went back to studying the land, and he had no answer to that, and they came down off the rise in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least honest, and the smoke rose from his chimney into a sky going the deep dusty rose of a prairie evening. And that was how Adeline Vance came to Calder's spread on the first night, carrying her secret against her chest and saying not one word of it to the man she had married on paper and had not yet, in any way that mattered, met. The house, when they came to it, was clean in the way a thing is clean when a man has decided that keeping it so is one of the few orders he can still give a world that has. Stopped obeying him. The floor was swept, the few pieces of furniture were squared against the walls, and a kettle sat on the iron stove. But it was a house that had stopped being a home, and Adeline saw that too. There were 2 chairs at a table built for 6. There was a row of pegs by the door, and on the lowest peg, child-high, hung a small gray coat that no child had worn in some while. And Josiah Calder's eyes went to it once when he thought she was not looking, and then went hard away from it. A girl came to the inner doorway. She was perhaps 6 years old, thin, with her uncle's dark hair and a gravity in her face that no child of 6 should have had to learn, and she looked at Adeline with the wary, weighing look of a creature that has had things taken from it. "This is Tabitha," Josiah said, and the gentleness that came into his voice when he said the child's name was so at odds with everything else about him that Adeline marked it the way you mark the one warm window in a dark street. "My brother's girl. She lives here now." He did not say why. He did not have to. The small coat on the low peg had already said it. "Hello, Tabitha," Adeline said, and she did not crouch down and make a show of herself the way grown people do with children they want to win. She only said it plainly, woman to person, and the child took the measure of that and did not run, which, from Tabitha, was a great deal. That first night, Adeline cooked them a supper out of what she found in the larder, which was little enough: flour, salt pork, a few withered potatoes, coffee, and she made it taste like more than it was. And she watched Josiah Calder eat as though he had forgotten food could be a comfort, and was startled, almost angry, to be reminded. He ate 2 helpings and said nothing, which, from him she would come to learn, was the highest praise he knew how to give. When the meal was done, she washed the plates and Tabitha dried them, the 2 of them working in a silence that was easier than the one between the grown people, and Josiah sat by the lamp with his hands open on the table and stared at nothing. "There's a room," he said at last, not looking at her. "Was my brother and his wife's. It's yours. I'm in the lean off the kitchen. I'll not trouble you." He said it stiffly, getting it out of the way, a man laying down the terms of a contract so there could be no mistake about it later. "I won't pretend this is anything it isn't. You keep the house and the books, and you'll want for nothing I can give, which God knows isn't much these days. That's the whole of the bargain. I'm not—" And here he stopped, and something moved behind the winter-gray eyes, and he finished lower, "I'm not in any condition to be a husband to anyone. I want to be straight with you about that from the start." "I didn't come here to be lied to," Adeline said. "I'd rather a hard truth told plain than a kind one told false. We'll get on well enough if you keep to that." And she took up the lamp and went to the room that had been a dead woman's. And she set the leather case at the bottom of the trunk and laid her few dresses over it. And she lay a long time in the dark, listening to the wind worry at the eaves and to the house creak as it cooled, and she thought about the deed folded in its oilskin at the bottom of the trunk, and she thought that there would be a right time to tell him, and that this was not it. And she was right about that, though the right time would cost her more than she yet knew. The morning came up hard and bright over the short grass, and Adeline Vance was awake before it, which was the first surprise she handed Josiah Calder, and not the last. By the time he came out of his lean-to, stiff and unrested, there was coffee made and biscuits in the pan, and a fire going against the dawn chill, and Tabitha was already at the table with her hands folded, watching the new woman move about the kitchen with the fascinated solemnity of a child watching the world quietly right itself. He stood in the doorway a moment and took it in, and she saw the suspicion in him, the certainty that anything that looked this much like a kindness was bound to cost him later, and she did not try to talk him out of it. She only set a plate in front of him and went on about her work, and let the morning make its own argument. The books were where he meant to put her, and the books were where she meant to begin, and so on the second morning she asked him plainly for them, and he hesitated the way a man hesitates before he opens a wound to a stranger's eyes. He brought down from the high shelf a long gray ledger bound in cracked leather and a cigar box stuffed with notes and receipts, and a curt, square-cornered letters of men who are owed money and have stopped being polite about it, and he set them on the table in front of her like a man setting down something that had been too heavy to carry for a long time. "I'll tell you straight, it's bad," he said. "I'm not a hand with figures. My brother kept all this. After—" he started again. "After I tried to carry it, and I couldn't, and it got away from me. There's a note at the bank. There's accounts in town I can't square. I don't rightly know how deep it goes any more. I'm half afraid to." "Then we'll find out together," Adeline said, "and at least the not knowing will be over." And she sat down and opened the ledger and bent her head to it. And Josiah Calder went out to his stock, not knowing that he had just handed his entire ruin into the most capable pair of hands within 300 miles. She was at it the whole of that day and most of the next. She had a way with figures that was not cleverness exactly, but something steadier, a refusal to look away from a hard number, and she went through the cigar box note by note and built the whole sorry architecture of his debt up in clean columns where he had only ever seen a fog of dread. And when she had it, she understood several things he did not. She understood that the ranch itself was sound, the grass would come back with rest, the herd was thin but not sick, the creek though low was alive, and that what was killing him was not the land, but the paper. There was a note held by the Harlow Bend Bank, taken out by his brother in a good year against a bad one, and it had come due. And the man who held it meant to have either the money or the ranch, and from the cramped, courteous menace of the letters in the cigar box, she understood that he was a patient man and a thorough one, and that those are the most dangerous kind. His name was Renton Pell, and he ran the bank with the false Grand Front, and he came out to the Calder place himself on the 4th day, which told Adeline more than any letter had. A banker who is sure of his money sends a clerk. A banker who comes himself has decided he wants something more than his money back. He arrived in a polished buggy behind a matched team, a soft, well-fed man in a good coat with a watch chain across his middle, and a way of looking at a place as though he were already pricing the lumber. And he was unfailingly pleasant, which was the worst thing about him. "Mr. Calder," he said, climbing down, and this would be the new Mrs. Calder word travels. "My congratulations to you both." He smiled at Adeline, a smile that took her in and set her aside as a thing of no account in about a second and a half, and she let him think it and filed away the carelessness of it for later. "I won't take much of your day. I only thought, as a neighbor, I'd come and speak to you man to man about the note, rather than let it go to letters and lawyers. That's a cold way to do business between Christian men." "Say it then," Josiah said. He had gone very still, the way a man goes still when he is bracing to be hit. "The note comes due the 1st of October, Pell said, gently, regretfully, a man delivering bad weather he had no hand in. "Principal and the interest. It's a considerable sum, as you know. Now, I've no wish in the world to take a man's home from him. None. But the bank's a thing with its own appetites, you understand, and there are men on my board with no sentiment at all. If you can't meet it, I'd far rather buy the place from you outright, at a fair figure, before it comes to foreclosure, let you walk away with something in your pocket and your head up instead of nothing. There's a party interested in the land, a development party. They'd pay, and I'd see you treated decent in the bargain. Think on it. There's no shame in a man knowing when he's beat." It was so smoothly done, so wrapped in kindness, that Josiah had no answer to it, and Adeline watched the thing land on him and saw him fold a little under the weight of it, and she felt something rise in her that she had not felt in 2 years, a cold, clean anger with an edge of joy on it, because she knew several things Renton Pell did not. And the chief of them was sitting at the bottom of her trunk in an oilskin wrapper. But she said nothing. It was not the time. She only stepped forward and said, in the mild voice of a wife who knows her place, "Will you take coffee before you drive back, Mr. Pell?" It's a long road in the heat, and the banker, charmed by her ordinariness, said he would. And she gave him coffee and listened to him talk, and learned the shape of him and let him go away thinking he had frightened a broke rancher and a foolish bride, which was exactly what she wanted him to think. When the buggy was a plume of dust on the eastern road, Josiah sat down heavily on the porch step and put his head in his hands. "October," he said. "I can't make October. Not the half of it. There's no figure I can run that gets me to October." And for a moment all the hardness was gone out of him, and there was only a tired man at the end of his rope, and Tabitha came and stood against his side without a word, and he put an arm around the child and held on, and Adeline, watching from the doorway, understood that whatever else this man was, he was not a coward, and he was not unkind. He was only a person who had been knocked down too many times to believe he could get up again, and she made up her mind in that moment about a thing she had not been sure of until then. "There's a development party," she said. He said it twice. A banker who only wants his money doesn't keep saying development party. Did he say who? "No," Josiah said, dully. "Speculators. The railroad surveying a spur through this country. Land that's got water on it, good water, year-round water, is worth 10 times dry land to them. Everybody knows it. That's why Pell's not really after the money, he's after the creek." And there it was, laid bare, and Adeline turned it over in her mind and saw the whole game at last, and saw, too, the one card in it that nobody at the table knew she was holding. She said nothing of it. She only said, "Then we'd best make the place worth keeping, hadn't we?" And she went in to start the supper. And that night she sat up long after the house was asleep, with the ledger open before her and a tallow candle burning down, doing the only kind of fighting she had ever been any good at, which was the patient kind, the kind done in columns, the kind that wins quietly or not at all. The town, meanwhile, had made up its mind about her, and not kindly. A bought wife was a thing for the women of Harlow Bend to talk about over their fences, and a bought wife who was too handsome and too cool-eyed and kept too much to herself was a thing they could not forgive. When she came to the mercantile, they went quiet and then too loud. When she came to church, they left a space around her in the pew as though plainness might be catching. There was one woman, the storekeeper's wife, a sharp, narrow person named Etta Cruz, who took it as a particular duty to let Adeline know where she stood, and did it with the small cruelties that such women keep ready. A slight at the counter, a remark just loud enough, a way of pricing her goods a penny higher than the next woman's and daring her to say so. Adeline paid the penny and said nothing, and remembered. She had been despised by experts in her time, and Etta Cruz was a rank amateur, and Adeline had long ago learned that the surest answer to contempt is not anger, but patience and time. And she had a great deal of both. There was one afternoon early on that told the whole of who she was, had Josiah only known to watch for it. The single cattle buyer at the railhead, a thick-necked man named Dorsey, who had grown fat on the discounts he wrung out of desperate ranchers, made his usual ride through that fall. And he came to the Calder place expecting the same easy pickings he had always had off Josiah, and he found instead a quiet woman at the kitchen table with a ledger open and 2 letters laid beside it. She let him make his low offer. Then she slid the 2 letters across the table. Answers, she explained pleasantly, from buyers in 2 other towns who had heard the Calder beef was sound and wanted it, and who had named their prices in writing. She did not raise her voice or press him. She only let him read the figures and do his own arithmetic and understand that the world had changed on him at this one table without his being consulted, and Dorsey, who had never in his life been outmaneuvered by a rancher's wife and did not enjoy the novelty, chewed his lip and raised his price a third on the spot rather than lose the beef to a rival, and rode off considerably less fat than he had come. Adeline folded the 2 letters away without a flicker. It was the patient kind of winning, done in columns and in nerve, the only kind she had ever cared for, and it was the first dollar she ever put back into Josiah Calder's empty pocket, though it would by no means be the last. What Adeline did with the books in those first weeks was a quiet kind of miracle, the sort nobody sees because it makes no noise. She did not find money where there was none. What she found was waste and bad bargains and small steady leaks that a tired and grieving man had not had the heart to plug. She found that Josiah was selling his beef to a single buyer at the railhead who took a hard discount for the favor of buying it all, and she found 2 other buyers by mail and played them one against the other until the price came up a full third. She found that he was paying interest on a feed account he could have closed out by selling a wagon he never used. She found that the mercantile had been padding his bill in the small, deniable ways that a store will pad the bill of a man it does not expect to ever check, and she went to town with the ledger under her arm and laid it open on Etta Cruz's own counter, and went down the column item by item in a voice as pleasant as a spring morning, until the storekeeper himself came out from the back, read to the ears, and adjusted the account. She did not gloat. She thanked him and bought her flour and walked out, and the women by the pickle barrel did not say one word as she passed, and that silence was sweeter to her than any speech. None of it saved the ranch. She knew that. A third more on the beef and a closed feed account and an honest grocery bill were a bucket bailed against a flood. They did not touch the great dark bulk of the banknote waiting out there in October, but they did 2 things that mattered more than money just then. They bought a little time. And they showed Josiah Calder, who had been told by the whole shape of his life that he was a man who lost things, that a thing once lost could sometimes be gotten back, that the slide was not, after all, a law of nature, and that there was at least one person under his roof who did not intend to slide. He started to watch her differently, not warmly, not yet. He was too guarded a man and too freshly hurt for that, but with a wary, dawning respect that he did not want to feel and could not quite refuse. He took to sitting across the table from her in the evenings while she worked the figures, mending tack or cleaning a harness buckle, not talking, just there, and Tabitha would be on the floor by the stove with a slate Adeline had bought her, learning her letters, and the lamp would make a small warm island of the 3 of them in the great dark of the prairie night. And though not one of them would have called it happiness, it was the nearest thing to it that house had held in a long while. The thing that finally cracked his guard came in June, and it came, as such things do on a ranch, through an animal. There was a heifer, a good young red one that Josiah set particular store by because she had been his brother's, the first of a line he had meant to build the herd back up from. And she came down sick in the night with a bloat or a fever. He could not tell which, and neither at first could Adeline. And she went down in the far corral and could not get up, and her sides heaved, and she rolled her eyes. And a cow that cannot get up is a cow 3 parts dead already. Josiah worked over her in the lantern light with a desperation out of all proportion to the worth of one animal, because she was not one animal to him. She was the last of his brother. She was the proof that he could still keep one living thing he loved from being taken, and Adeline saw all of that in his face and rolled up her sleeves and got down in the dirt beside him without being asked. They worked over that heifer the whole night through. Adeline knew stock. It was another of the things her father had given her, and she knew the trick of a trocar and the trick of drenching and the older trick still of simple, stubborn patience, of keeping the animal's head up and walking her when she could be made to walk, and never once letting her quit. Toward the gray of morning the heifer belched enormously, and her sides came down, and she heaved herself up onto her feet and stood swaying and alive, and Josiah Calder put his hand flat on her wet red flank and bowed his head, and Adeline saw that his shoulders were shaking, and she had the grace to look away and let a hard man have his moment unwatched. "Thank you," he said, when he could. His voice was not steady. "I couldn't have. If she'd died, I think something in me would have died with her. And I'm not too proud to say it. So, thank you." "She's a good cow," Adeline said, which was her way of saying all the rest of it, the part neither of them was ready to say out loud. And he understood her, and something passed between them in the cold dawn over the back of a saved heifer that was the true beginning of their marriage, whatever the paper said. After that, he led her further in. He showed her the whole of the range, riding the bounds of it with her over 2 long days, and she saw that her first read of it had been right, that it was good land badly used, land that had been asked to give more than it had and never given a rest, and she began to plan the careful rotation that would let it heal. He showed her the creek. And she walked its banks alone one evening and saw the year-round seep that fed it even in the dry, and she understood exactly why a railroad speculator would want it badly enough to ruin a man for it, and she understood her own deed a little better, too, because the thing folded in the oilskin at the bottom of her trunk was bound up with water rights very like these. And the seeing of Josiah's Creek told her things about her own buried business that she had not let herself think about in 2 long years. Word of the saved heifer got around, the way everything got around in a country with little else to talk of, and the cool weighing look the town gave Adeline began, grudgingly, to change. A rancher named Burl Tanner, an old leathery bachelor who ran a few hundred head north of the Calder place and owed nobody anything and feared nobody at all, took to tipping his hat to her in town, and Burl Tanner's good opinion was worth 10 of Etta Cruz's bad one, because everybody knew Burl judged a person by what they could do and not by what they were said to be. He came by the ranch one afternoon on some pretext of borrowed tools and stayed 2 hours talking stock with Adeline on the porch, and went away shaking his head and telling anyone who would listen that Calder's bought-up bride knew more about cattle and grass than 3/4 of the men who'd been born to it and to town. Hearing this from a man like Burl began the slow work of changing its mind. The development party put a face to itself in July, and the face belonged to a man named Cyrus Falk. He came up from the railhead in a hired rig with a clerk and a leather portfolio and a way of wearing fine clothes in dusty country that managed to look both careless and pointed, as if to say he did not belong here and would not be staying and meant the whole territory to know it. He was perhaps 40, smooth-shaven, soft-handed, with a quick assessing eye and a voice trained to sound reasonable while it took everything from you. And he was. Adeline understood the moment she laid eyes on him, the truly dangerous man in the affair. Renton Pell was merely the local lever. But Cyrus Falk was the hand that meant to pull it. He had bought up notes and options all along the creek, she learned, working quietly through Pell for the better part of a year, 3 small homesteads already signed away, 2 more wavering, and the Calder place was the keystone of it, because the Calder place held the best of the year-round water and the natural line the railroad spur would want to follow. With the Calder Creek in hand, Cyrus Falk would control the only reliable water for 40 miles in a country where the railroad was about to make water worth more than gold, and he would sell it back to that railroad and to every dry land farmer the railroad brought in after, at whatever price he cared to name. It was not a wicked plan, exactly. It was only a cold one. A plan that saw 100 families' livelihoods as a column of figures and saw nothing wrong in being the man who owned the figures. He came out to the Calder place all courtesy, the way Pell had, and he made Josiah an offer that was meant to sound generous and was in truth a robbery dressed for church, enough to clear the note and leave a little besides, enough that a beaten man might take it and call himself lucky, far less than the land was worth and a fraction of what the water alone would bring Falk once the rails came through. He laid it out on the porch table with his clerk taking notes, and he was patient and pleasant, and he never once raised his voice, and Adeline, serving the coffee, watched him not look at her, and understood that here was a second man who had made the same mistake Pell had, the mistake of pricing her at nothing, and she was beginning to think that the underestimation of women must be the most expensive habit a certain kind of man ever indulged. "I'll want to study on it," Josiah said, which was more spine than Falk had expected from him, and the speculator's smooth face showed the faintest flicker of impatience before the courtesy came back down over it like a blind. "Of course. Take your time," Falk said, rising, gathering his portfolio. "Only, and I say this as a friend to your situation, Mr. Calder, not as a man with an interest, do bear in mind that the note falls due whatever you decide, and that Mr. Pell's board is not a patient body, and that my offer is good only so long as the land is yours to sell. Once the bank has it, you understand, there's nothing left to offer for. It would grieve me to see a good man come away from this with nothing in his hand, when he might have come away with something. Think on it. I'll call again before October." And he climbed into his rig and was gone in a roll of dust, and the threat had been so gently made that it took Josiah a moment to feel that he had been threatened at all. That night was the low point, the true bottom of it, and it was the night Adeline came near to telling him everything and did not. She found him in the barn long after dark, sitting on an upended bucket in the dark, with the heifer's stall warm beside him, and he did not turn when she came in. "I'm going to take it," he said, "Falk's offer. I've run it every way there is. I can fight Pell, or I can fight Falk, but I can't fight the both of them and the note and the calendar all at once, and if I wait for October, I'll have nothing. And there's Tabitha to think of. A man with a child can't gamble the roof on his pride. I'll take the offer, and we'll go somewhere and start over small. I'm sorry. You married into a sinking thing, and I knew it when I sent for you, and I let you anyway, and that was a poor thing to do to a person, and I'm sorry for it. And Adeline stood in the dark barn with the words right there in her mouth, "I have a deed, Josiah. I have water rights of my own. I am not what you think I am. I never was." And she did not say them, because she had told a man the truth once before, 2 years gone. A man she had trusted with her whole life and her whole inheritance, and that man had used the truth to take everything from her and leave her with nothing but an oilskin packet and a long flight west, and the wound of it was not healed, and the fear of it rose up in her now and closed her throat. She was not ready. She did not yet trust this gray-eyed, grieving man the way you have to trust a person before you hand them the thing that can destroy you. And so she said only, "Don't take it yet. Give me till harvest. I'm asking you to trust me one more month." And Josiah looked at her in the dark a long while. And then he said, "All right. 1 month. God knows you've earned the asking." And that was the most either of them had given the other yet. And it was not enough, and Adeline lay awake the whole night, knowing it was not enough, and afraid of what it would cost her to make it so. What broke the thing open was Tabitha. The child had been listening at doorways the way children do, gathering up the grown people's fears and carrying them around in silence the way children also do. And one evening near the end of that month she climbed into Adeline's lap, which she had never done, and asked her in a small voice whether they were going to have to go away from the only home she had left, and whether the man who came in the shiny rig was going to take it, and whether Adeline was going to leave too, the way her mother and father had left, by which the child meant die. And Adeline held the small body against her and felt the whole truth of her own situation rearrange itself in an instant around the weight of that question, because she had been guarding her secret to guard herself, and that had been a kind of wisdom. But it had become a kind of cowardice, and a person who would let a child lose her home to keep a paper safe in a trunk was not a person Adeline Vance was willing to be. She put Tabitha to bed. Then she went and got the oilskin packet out of the bottom of the trunk, and she unwrapped it on the kitchen table by the lamp, and she sat down across from Josiah Calder, who was mending a bridle and watching her with a slow dawning alarm, and she said, "I have to tell you what I am, and when I've told you, you're going to be angry, and you'll have the right to be. And I'm going to ask you to stay angry and trust me anyway, which is a hard thing to ask a man. But it's the only way I know to save your ranch, and I find I'm not willing to watch you lose it. So sit, and let me tell it all the way through before you say anything, because if I stop, I might not start again." And she told it. She told him that her father had been a man named Harmon Vance, who had come out of the war with nothing and built over 20 hard years one of the largest cattle and land holdings in the Texas Hill Country. Not a flashy fortune, but a deep one, ground in slow and solid range and water and breeding stock, and a name that meant something at every bank from San Antonio to the Red River. She told him she had been her father's only living child, and that he had raised her the way a man raises an heir and not the way the world expected a daughter to be raised, taught her the land and the stock, and above all the books, taught her that a holding lives or dies on whether someone is willing to look the numbers in the eye. Taught her that the difference between a rich man and a ruined one is very often just one honest ledger kept by one stubborn person who will not flinch. She told him her father had died when she was 25, and that the holding had passed to her, and that within the year she had made the one great mistake of her life. She had married a man named Royce Adair, handsome and charming, and a guest in every good house in the county. A man who courted her with such patience and such apparent tenderness that she, who could read land and ledges like Scripture, had failed entirely to read him. And once the vows were said, he had set about, with a lawyer's quiet cunning, to strip her of everything, to maneuver the holding into his own name parcel by parcel, to forge and to flatter, and to isolate her from the old hands who might have warned her, until she woke one morning to find that the inheritance her father had spent his life building was being conveyed out from under her, and that the law, as the law then stood for a married woman, gave her almost no ground to stand on. Almost none, Adeline said, but not quite none. My father, God keep him, did not trust easy, and he had built one thing into the holding that Royce never found. Because it was not in the main books, it was in my father's own hand in a place only I knew to look. There was a tract, the home tract, the heart of it, the range with the great springs on it, the water that made all the rest worth anything. And my father, years before he died, had deeded that one tract not to his estate, where a husband's lawyers could reach it, but to me, separately, in my own name, recorded and witnessed and filed in the county, a daughter's portion he set aside against exactly the kind of ruin that came. Royce got the rest. He got the cattle and the outer range and a name and houses. But he never got the water. Because he never knew the water had been carved out and given to me alone, and a holding without its water is a body without a heart. It looks alive for a season, and then it dies. So I let him have the rest. I took the one deed that mattered, and I ran. Because a man who will steal a fortune will not stop at a wife who can prove he stole it. I have been running for 2 years. I answered your advertisement because the Nebraska Panhandle was about as far from the Texas Hill Country as a person could get for the price of a stage ticket, and because a married woman is harder for a vengeful first husband to reach than a single one. And because I was tired, Josiah, so tired, of being a woman with a fortune in her trunk and not a soul on this earth she could tell. She stopped. The lamp guttered. Josiah Calder had not moved through the whole of it, and his face had gone through several countries, disbelief and a flash of anger, and something that might have been hurt, and now it settled into a stillness she could not read. "So that's why you wouldn't give me the case," he said slowly. "First day. The case. The deeds in it. It's never been out of my reach since I left Texas, and you let me sit here a month talking about taking Falk's robbery. You let me decide I was a man who'd lost everything. You let me say it to your face in that barn. And the whole time I was afraid," she said, and she did not soften it. "I told the truth once to a man I'd married, and he used it to take everything I had. I am not made of iron, Josiah. I had to learn whether you were Royce Adair before I could hand you the thing that ruined me at his hands. That was a hard, cold, calculating way to use a person, and you're entitled to be angry about it, and I won't tell you not to be. I'm only telling you it wasn't cruelty. It was a burned child being careful of the fire." The silence went on a long time. Out in the barn the saved heifer shifted and lowed once. Somewhere a coyote took up its thin complaint, and another answered it. And when Josiah Calder finally spoke it, it was not what she had braced for. He did not rage, and he did not crow about being saved. "I'm angry," he said. "I want to be straight with you about that, the way you've been straight with me tonight. Because I think we'd best be a couple that says the true thing even when it's the hard one, or we won't be anything at all. I'm angry you sat across this table from me for a month and watched me drown and held the rope behind your back. I understand why. I even think, was I in your boots, I might have done the same. And that's the part that's hardest to swallow. That you weren't wrong to be careful of me, because I'm a stranger you bought your safety from with a stage ticket, same as I bought a wife. So I'm angry, and I don't aim to pretend I'm not. But I'm sitting here. I'm not going anywhere. And if you're telling me there's a way to keep this place and put Cyrus Falk back in his shiny rig with nothing, then God help me, I want to hear it. And we'll sort out the rest of what we are to each other after, the slow way, the way you sort out anything worth keeping. Is that honest enough? That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 2 years, Adeline said, and her own voice was not quite steady now, and she put her hand flat on the table between them, not reaching for his. Just laying it there in the lamplight where he could take it or not as he chose, and after a moment, slowly, the way a man does a thing he is not sure he is allowed, Josiah Calder put his rough hand over her cool one, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed saying, and that was the night the contract quietly stopped being a contract and started, against all the odds and both their fears, being a marriage. The plan she laid out over the next several nights was not a thing of guns or threats, because Adeline Vance had learned long ago that the men who win in the end are almost never the loudest men in the room. They are the ones who have read the paper more carefully than anyone else and have the patience to wait for the other fellow to overreach. The deed in the oilskin was worth a great deal of money, but it was money locked up in Texas land that a vengeful first husband still half controlled, money she could not simply pour out on a Nebraska bank counter. What it gave her was not ready cash. What it gave her was standing, and a thing more valuable than standing, which was knowledge. The whole education of a woman raised to run a great holding, the understanding of exactly how a man like Cyrus Falk assembles a water monopoly and exactly where such a structure is weak. The first thing she did was the thing nobody expected, because it required admitting the secret to one more person, and she chose her person with care. She went to old Burl Tanner. She laid the whole of it before him on his own porch, the deed, the Texas holding, Royce Adair, Falk's scheme along the creek, all of it, because Burl ran good land north of the Calder place that Falk had been quietly trying to option to, and because Burl owed nobody and feared nobody and had a long memory for a slight. And because the one thing a patient cold schemer like Falk could not survive was the ranchers along that creek deciding to stop being picked off one at a time and start standing together. "He's been buying us up like he was buying eggs," Burl said, when she had finished chewing it over. "One at a time, quiet, so a man feels like the last fool standing and takes the offer, for he's left holding nothing. That's the whole trick, ain't it? Make every man think he's alone." "That's the whole trick," Adeline agreed. "It only works one ranch at a time. It doesn't work against all of you at once. A railroad needs a clear, single line of water rights it can count on for 50 years. If every holding along this creek is tangled in its own contracts and its own holdouts and its own lawsuits, Falk hasn't got a clean thing to sell, and a railroad won't pay top dollar for a fight. The water's only worth a fortune to him if it comes wrapped up neat. We're going to make it the opposite of neat." And that is what they did, and it was the kind of fight Adeline was made for. She had Josiah and Burl ride the creek and gather the wavering homesteaders into Burl's barn of an evening, and she stood up in front of them, a bought bride, a woman, an outsider 3 months in the country, and she opened the books, hers and theirs, and she showed them in plain figures what their water would be worth to the railroad if they held it together and sold it on their own terms instead of letting Falk buy it for pennies and sell it for dollars. She showed them how Falk's options were written, the small print he had counted on none of them reading, the clauses that lapsed if a payment schedule was met, the rights of first refusal he had thought safely bought. She had read every line of every contract Falk had floated in that country, having quietly obtained copies through the county recorder where they were filed. And she knew his structure better than he did, the way a person who builds a thing knows it less well than the person who has set out to take it apart. There was a banker's son in the next county, a young lawyer named Del Marsh, who had no love for Renton Pell and a great deal of ambition, and Adeline brought him into it. And he confirmed in proper legal language what she had worked out in her own head, that Falk's water monopoly was a house of cards held up entirely by everyone's belief that resistance was useless, and that the moment 3 or 4 key holdings refused to sell and instead pooled their rights into a single ranchers' association that could deal with the railroad directly. Falk's whole assembled position would be worth a fraction of what he had paid for it, and Pell's bank, exposed on the notes it had taken to finance Falk's buying, would be in a very uncomfortable position indeed. The Calder note still had to be met, and met it was, in a way that gave Adeline a satisfaction she was almost ashamed of. She did not pay it from a fortune she did not have. Instead, with Del Marsh drawing the papers, the new Ranchers Association, the holdings along the creek, pooled, advanced the Calder Ranch the money to clear the banknote, secured against the Calder water rights, which the association now had every reason to keep in friendly hands rather than let fall to Pell. In one stroke the note was cleared, the bank lost its leverage, and the creek's water passed out of Falk's reach and into the keeping of the people who actually lived on it. Adeline's own deed, the Texas Tract, was never spent at all. It did not need to be. It had done its work simply by teaching her how the game was played. The knowledge had turned out to be the true inheritance all along, worth more than the land it described. Cyrus Falk came one last time, in late September, when he understood at last what had happened to him. He was not smooth any longer. The courtesy had worn through to the cold thing underneath, and he stood on the Calder porch with his portfolio under his arm and looked at Adeline, looked at her properly, at last, the way he should have looked at her in July. And she watched the recognition come into his face, the understanding of who it was that had quietly dismantled a year of his patient work. "You," he said. "It was you." Pell said the wife kept the books. I didn't. He stopped, and something almost like respect crossed his face and was gone. "Who are you?" "Adeline Vance," she said, "Harmon Vance's daughter out of the Texas Hill Country. You may have heard the name. My father did to men like you, for 30 years, exactly what I have just done to you, and he taught me how before he died. You made the same mistake about me that another man made once, and it cost him less than it's going to cost you, because he was only greedy, and you've been greedy on credit. Mister, Pell holds a good deal of paper on your buying, I believe. I'd see to that, where I you before the railroad's agent comes through next month and finds there's nothing clean here to buy. Good day. The road's the same one you came in on. And Cyrus Falk, who had ruined 3 homesteads and meant to ruin 40, climbed into his hired rig and drove east out of Harlow Bend and never came back. And the dust of him hung in the still September air a long while after he was gone, and then the wind off the short grass took even that away. The first winter came down hard on the heels of that victory, as if the country meant to remind the Calders that it took more than a cleared note to keep a place alive. And it was in that winter that the town finished the long work of changing its mind about Adeline Vance. December came in cold and gray, the way the Panhandle did it, not the dramatic cold of the mountains. Just a dry, seeping cold that got into the bones of a house and stayed, and then in late January a blizzard came up out of the northwest that shut the whole country in white for 3 days, the kind of storm the old hands measured the rest of their lives against. When it broke at last and the men dug out, the word came that the storm had caught a family of newcomers. A young couple with 3 small children who had filed on a dry claim east of town and had no business being out in that country at all, half starved and snowed in with their fuel gone and their stock dead in the drifts. The husband down with a fever that had turned to something in his chest. Harlow Bend, which was a hard town in a hard country, debated the matter the way such towns do, with a good deal of talk about people who file on land they can't work, and the foolishness of charity that only teaches a man to expect it. Adeline did not debate it. She loaded the buckboard with what the larder held and a sack of her own flour and the heavy quilts off her own beds, and she had Josiah hitch the team, and she drove out through the cut drifts to that frozen claim shanty with her jaw set, and she found the family near the end of it, and she went to work. She did not make a speech about Christian duty. She built up the fire and got broth into the children and sat up 2 nights running with the fevered man, drenching the chest fever the way she would have drenched a sick animal, with the same plain refusal to let a living thing quit that had pulled the heifer up out of the dirt, and on the 3rd morning the fever broke and the man would live. And because Adeline had gone, others came after, Burl Tanner with a load of fuel and a pair of his own milk cows to replace the dead stock. And then, shamed into it, Etta Cruz herself, with a basket of provisions and a stiff offer to mind the children, and by the time the thaw came, that family was on its feet, and that claim was saved. And the whole of Harlow Bend understood, in the way a town understands a thing all at once after resisting it for a year, that the bought bride out at the Calder place was not the cold, calculating creature they had decided she was, but something the country had precious little of and badly needed, which was a person who would simply do the hard right thing in front of her without waiting to be asked or thanked. After that winter, no one in Harlow Bend left a space around Adeline Calder in the church pew. After that winter, they saved her a seat. The thing between Adeline and Josiah did not resolve itself in a single scene, the way such things never do in life, whatever they may do in stories. The anger he had owned to that night in the kitchen did not vanish because the ranch was saved. It eased the way a sprain eases, slowly, with use, with 100 small ordinary mornings laid down one on top of another until the soreness was gone before either of them noticed it going. They were, in the weeks after Falk drove east, like 2 people learning a language they had each spoken only badly before, the language of being trusted and being trustworthy. And they made the beginner's mistakes in it and forgave them and went on. He told her things he had told no one. He told her about his brother Amos, who had been the easy one, the laughing one, the one people loved on sight, and about how it had always been Josiah's quiet lot to be the steady brother, the one who carried the hard end of things and did not get thanked, and how, when the diphtheria took Amos and Amos's wife both in one terrible January week and left Josiah with the ranch and the debt and a grieving child and no one to laugh anymore, he had felt something in himself, simply close, like a house shutting up for a winter that did not end. He told her he had not sent for a wife because he wanted one. He had sent for a wife because the silence in the house had begun to frighten him, and a man who keeps the books cannot keep them when the figures swim because his hands are shaking, and he had thought, in a cold, beaten way, that he would hire a stranger to keep the silence off and the columns straight and would not have to feel anything about her at all. "And then you got down in the dirt with that heifer," he said, "and worked the night through beside me and never once asked me to thank you, and I felt something for the first time since January, and it scared me worse than the debt did. Because a man can lose a ranch and live. I wasn't sure I could lose another person, so I'd about decided not to let myself have one. You made that hard. You made it impossible, if you want the truth of it, and I've been a poor hand at letting you know it, and I'm telling you now." Adeline, for her part, told him about Royce Adair, all of it, not as a thing she was confessing, but as a thing she was simply at last able to set down. She told him how the shame of having been fooled had been worse than the loss of the fortune, how a woman raised to read men and ledgers had been unable to bear that she had read one man so catastrophically wrong, and how she had run not only from Royce but from her own humiliation, and had built around herself a wall of competence so high that no one could get close enough to fool her again or to know her again, which turned out to be the same wall. "I made myself a fortress," she said, "and the trouble with a fortress is that you're the one locked inside it. You're the first person in 2 years I've opened the gate to. I find it's a great relief. I find I should have done it long ago, and I'm glad it was you I waited for." There was a small business yet to settle, and they settled it together, which was itself a kind of vow. Word came, through Del Marsh's legal connections, that Royce Adair's grand stolen holding down in Texas had begun, as Adeline had always quietly known it must, to fail, because Royce had taken the land and the cattle and the name, but he had never had the head for the books that the thing required, and a great holding without an honest ledger and without its water is a slow shipwreck, and Royce's was going down by inches. He had sold off pieces. He had borrowed against the rest. And now the word came he had at last understood about the home tract, the water, the daughter's portion he had never been able to find or break, and he meant to come north and pressure Adeline into selling it back to him cheap to save the wreck of what he had stolen. 2 years before, the thought of Royce Adair coming for her would have sent Adeline running again. Now she sat at her own kitchen table in her own saved house with her own husband across from her, and felt nothing but a kind of cold steadiness. "Let him come," Josiah said. "He'll find you're not a woman alone any more. He'll find a county that stands together, and a lawyer who loved the work, and a husband who keeps a clean rifle and a cleaner temper. And he'll find that the deed's been recorded and re-recorded and witnessed 6 ways since you got here, because your wife, Adair, is a careful woman who reads the paper. Let him come and learn it. Some men only ever learn anything the expensive way." Royce Adair did come that next spring, and the meeting was brief and almost an anticlimax, because a swindler shorn of surprise and standing on hostile ground is a small thing after all. He found Adeline flanked by Del Marsh and a county that had come, over 1 short year, to regard the Calder wife as something close to its own conscience, and he made his threats and saw them land on nothing. And he made his offer and saw it refused. And in the end he understood that the careful, frightened girl he had robbed 2 years before had become a woman he could not move at all. And he went back south to manage the long failure of the fortune he had stolen, which was, as Adeline observed without much heat, a punishment more fitting than any a court could have handed down, to spend the rest of his life watching a great thing die in his hands for want of the one quality he had never had and could not buy. She never saw him again. She did not need to. She had stopped being afraid of him somewhere on the road between the woman she had been and the woman she had let herself become, and a thing you have stopped being afraid of has no more power over you, whatever it owns on paper. The ranch came back the way she had promised the land it could. The rotation she set healed the grass over 2 seasons until the range carried half again the stock it had when she came. The pooled water rights along the creek, held now by the Ranchers' Association she had built in Burl Tanner's barn, turned out to be worth exactly what she had told the homesteaders they were worth. And when the railroad spur came through in 1886. It was the association that dealt with the railroad and not Cyrus Falk, and the water was sold on the rancher's own terms, on a lease that paid every holding along the creek a yearly sum that turned hard, scrabbling families into comfortable ones and turned the comfortable into something near to wealthy. The Calder spread, with the best of the water, did best of all. By 1888, it ran more cattle than any spread in the county, and its books, kept in Adeline's clean, unflinching hand, were the soundest in the territory. And Renton Pell, whose bank had nearly foundered on the bad paper Falk left behind, had learned to take his hat clear off when he passed Mrs. Calder on the street, which Adeline accepted with a gravity that only Josiah knew was very nearly laughter. The town came around entire, as towns do, swinging from contempt to pride, with no memory of ever having felt the first. Eddie Cruz, who had priced Adeline's flour a penny high, lived to brag to travelers that she had known the famous Mrs. Calder from her very first week in the country and had always said there was quality in her, and Adeline let her have the lie, because by then she had long since stopped needing the town's good opinion and could afford to be generous with it. She used some of the new prosperity to do a thing her father would have understood. She put up money and got the association to put up more for a proper schoolhouse in Harlow Bend, a real one, with a real teacher brought out from the East. Because the country was filling with children now that the rails had come, and a child's mind was the one piece of ground Adeline Vance believed must never be left to go dry. Tabitha was the first to walk through its door. The love, when it came fully, came the way everything real about Josiah Calder came, slowly, plainly, and shown rather than spoken. He was never a man for fine words, and Adeline did not ask him to become one. She had learned the cost of fine words at Royce Adair's hands, and had come to trust the plain ones a great deal more. What Josiah gave her instead was 1,000 small acts so quiet that a careless person would have missed them, and Adeline was not a careless person. He learned how she took her coffee and had it ready before she came in cold from the calving sheds. He mended the loose board on her side of the porch step without a word the day after she stumbled on it. When she sat up late over the books, the way she always would, he took to bringing the lamp closer and sitting up with her, not talking. Just keeping her company in the circle of light so that she would not be doing the hard, solitary thing alone. Because he had understood, without being told, that the loneliest hour of her old life had been exactly that one, the late hour over the figures with no one near. and he had quietly made up his mind that she would never spend it alone again. It was on a night like that, near a year after the heifer, that he said the thing that made the marriage whole. They had been working in the lamplight, she at the ledger and he at a harness, and the wind was at the eaves, and Tabitha was long asleep, and out of a comfortable silence he set down the leather and looked at her and said, "I'd like for this to be a real marriage, not the paper kind, the kind that means it. I'm a slow man and a closed-up one, and I don't say things easy. And you'd be taking on a fellow who will likely never learn to say them the way you deserve to hear them. But I love you, Adeline, plain as that, and I have for a good while, and I wanted you to have it said out loud at least the once, even if I'm no hand at it. I wanted you to know it wasn't the deed or the ranch or any of it. It was you got down in the dirt with that heifer. It was always going to be you." And Adeline Vance, who had crossed an ocean of her own grief and a continent of her own fear to stand in the lamplight of a stranger's failing ranch, who had been robbed and frightened and despised and had built herself a fortress and locked herself inside it, set down her pen and looked at this plain, closed, gray-eyed man who had just said the truest thing anyone had ever said to her, and found that the fortress was simply gone, had been going for a year, brick by brick, without her ever deciding to take it down. "It was always going to be you, too," she said. "I think I knew it the first night, when you handed me up onto that buckboard like I was made of china, and then didn't say a kind word to me for an hour. I thought, there's a man who's forgotten how to be gentle and is ashamed of it. I thought I could spend a life teaching that man it's safe to be gentle again. I didn't know I'd want to, but I did. I do." And she crossed the small distance between the table and his chair, and that is as much of that night as belongs to anyone but the two of them. They were married again, in a manner of speaking, the next spring. Not the paper marriage of the advertisement, but a true one, witnessed by a county that had come to love them, in the new schoolhouse Adeline had built, with Burl Tanner standing up for Josiah and Tabitha carrying a fistful of prairie wildflowers gone half to seed. And it was the same two people and the same legal fact as before, and it was nothing at all like before, and everyone who was there understood the difference and said nothing about it, because some things are best honored in silence. Children came. A boy first, in 1885, whom they named Amos for the laughing brother, so that the name would go on laughing in the house after all, and a girl in 1887, named Harmon for a middle name after Adeline's father, because Adeline said a girl could carry a man's name forward as well as any boy and better than most. And Josiah, who had stopped being surprised by his wife's plain way of overturning the world's settled notions, only laughed and agreed. And there was Tabitha, who was a daughter in every way that the heart counts, even if the law had her down as a niece, and who grew up tall and grave and good with figures taught at her mother's elbow over the same ledgers, so that the thing Harmon Vance had built into his daughter went on building itself into the next one. The true inheritance passing down the way the only inheritances that matter ever pass down, hand to hand and not in any will. The house filled up. The silence that had frightened Josiah Calder into sending away for a stranger was driven out of it for good, replaced by the racket of children and the lowing of a healthy herd, and the creak of a porch swing he built with his own hands, and the low murmur of two people talking over the books at the end of a day, and if you had told that beaten man on the boardwalk in the spring of 1883, turning his hat in his hands, dreading the disappointment he was sure was climbing down off the stage, that this was what was coming, That the woman with the leather case held tight against her chest was carrying not just a deed, but the whole rest of his life, the good rest, the part he had stopped believing he would get. He would not have believed you, and he said as much himself years later. More than once, shaking his head at the sheer unlikely mercy of it. There was, in the end, a fortune after all, not the buried Texas one, which Adeline at last let go of entirely, signing the long-disputed home tract over to a cousin of her father's who would farm it honestly, glad to be free of the last thread that tied her to the worst year of her life. The fortune that came to the Calders came the slow, honest way, out of grass and water and good books and the kind of patience that compounds. And by the turn of the century the Calder spread was spoken of, in the plain way the country had of crowning its own, as the richest in 3 counties, not the showiest, never that, for neither Josiah nor Adeline had a particle of show in them. But the soundest, the most enduring, the one the bankers held up as the example and the young couples starting out asked to see. People who did not know the story assumed the Calders had come into the country with money. People who did know it told it of an evening the way you tell a thing you are proud to have been near. The story of the bought bride who stepped off the stage with a leather case held tight against her chest, and the broke gray-eyed rancher who expected nothing. And what the two of them made together out of debt and grief and short grass, when neither one of them had been looking for anything but a way to stop being so alone. Adeline did one more thing with the money, the thing that outlasted everything else and that her father, the slow, careful builder, would have understood best of all. In Harlow Bend, on the main street where Etta Cruz had once priced her flour a penny high, she built a library, a real one of good brick, with tall windows and long oak tables and shelves. She filled herself over years, traveling to the cities to choose the books, because she said a country that would fill up with people deserved somewhere those people's children could go to find out that the world was wider than a short grass county, and that a person born with nothing might read their way to anything. She endowed it so that it would stand and stock itself long after she was gone. She put no name on it. When the town wanted to call it the Calder Library, she would not have it. She let them call it only the Harlow Bend Reading Room, because, she said, the books did not belong to her. They belonged to whoever was lonely enough, or hungry enough, or stubborn enough to come in out of the wind and open one, the way she had once been all 3. By 1895, it had 1 long room. By 1901, it had 2. By the time Adeline was an old woman, it had 3, and a children's corner, and a chair by the south window that was understood by everyone in town to be Mrs. Calder's, where she sat most afternoons of her last years with a book open and the light coming in warm across the page. The years went by the way good years do, which is to say quietly and far too fast. The children grew and scattered and came back. Amos took over the running of the spread and ran it well, in his mother's clean, booked way, with his father standing at his shoulder less and less as the years took the strength out of Josiah's frame, though never out of his quiet. The girl, Harriet Harmon, married a doctor and stayed close, and gave them grandchildren who learned to read in the reading room their grandmother built. Tabitha, who had been 6 and grave and wary on the night the new woman came and did not crouch down to win her, grew up to keep the books not just of the Calder spread, but of half the county, a spinster by her own contented choosing. The most trusted pair of hands for 100 miles, and she said all her life that everything she was she had learned at Adeline Calder's elbow in the lamplight, and she meant it, and it was true. Josiah Calder grew old the way an oak grows old, slowly and then all at once. The winter gray eyes faded, but never lost the quiet. He never did become a man of fine words. To the end he showed his love in mended boards and warmed coffee, and the simple, unfailing fact of his presence in the chair across the table, and Adeline, who had learned the cost of fine words long before she met him, counted herself the richest woman in the territory for exactly that reason. He died in the spring of 1909 at the age of 60, in the bed in the house he had nearly lost, with his wife's hand in his and his children near. And his last clear words, Adeline told the grandchildren after, were not grand ones. He had never said a grand thing in his life, and did not start at the end. He looked at her and said, "You got down in the dirt with that heifer," which made no sense to anyone in the room but the two of them, and made all the sense in the world to her, because it was his way of saying the whole of it one last time, that she had come into his closed and frightened life and worked beside him in the dark without being asked, and never quit on the living thing he loved, and never quit on him. He died in a life he had not seen coming and would not have traded for any other, and Adeline closed his eyes with her own steady hand and did not weep until later, alone, the way they had both always done the hardest things. She lived 14 years more without him, and they were not empty years, though there was always after that an empty chair across the table that she would not let anyone fill or move. She ran the Spreads book still well into her 70s, her hand a little slower but never once unsure, and she kept her afternoons at the Reading room in the chair by the south window, and she became the thing every settled country eventually grows, which is its memory. The old woman who had been there at the start, who could tell you how the creek had run before the rails came, and who had built the schoolhouse and who had. The story went, though she never told it herself, face down a railroad speculator and a crooked bank, with nothing but a leather case and a head for figures, and won. The children of the children she had taught to read grew up half believing she had always been old and always been there, a fixed and gentle feature of the country like the bluffs in the West. And that is perhaps the truest wealth a person can come to in the end, to be so woven into a place that the place can no longer quite imagine itself without you. She thought often in those last years about the strange arithmetic of a life, how the worst thing that ever happened to her, the betrayal that drove her west with a fortune she could not spend and a fear she could not shed, had turned out to be the very road that carried her to the only happiness she had ever truly trusted. And how, if Royce Adair had been an honest man, she would have stayed in Texas, a rich and comfortable wife, and never once met the gray-eyed rancher on the boardwalk at Harlow Bend, never gotten down in the dirt with a sick heifer, never built a library or raised these children, or known what it was to be loved plainly by a plain and faithful man. She did not forgive Royce Adair, exactly. She had simply outlived the need to spend any feeling on him at all. But she came to a kind of peace with the shape of the thing, the way you come to peace with weather, and she used to say to Tabitha, in the slow plain way she had picked up from 40 years beside Josiah, that you never can tell at the time which of the days are the ones that will turn out to have been the whole of your life. That you think the great days are the loud ones, the wedding and the windfall and the disaster, and they are not. The great days are the ordinary ones, the 10,000 small mornings of coffee made and books kept, and a child taught her letters and a board mended on a porch step, The days that do not feel like anything much while you are spending them and turn out, when you look back from the far end, to have been everything you had and everything that mattered. Adeline Vance Calder died in the autumn of 1923 at the age of 67 in the house that had been her home for 40 years, in the same bed where Josiah had died 14 springs before. With Tabitha holding one hand and a grandchild holding the other, and the late October light coming gold and low through the window the way the light had come the first evening she rode down off the rise and saw the failing spread laid out below her and said to no one that it was bigger than the bank thought it was. She had been right about that, as she had been right about most things, in the patient, unflinching way of a woman who was never afraid to look a hard number in the eye. They buried her beside Josiah on the rise above the creek, where you could see the whole of the spread they had made, and a green ribbon of living water running through the middle of it, and the town she had come to a stranger and despised closed every door on the day of it and walked out behind her in a procession a half-mile long. And the reading room she built and would not put her name on stayed dark that one afternoon, the only afternoon in 40 years it ever closed, and then opened again the next morning, the way she would have wanted, its doors open to whoever was lonely enough or hungry enough or stubborn enough to come in out of the wind. What she left was not the kind of thing that makes the histories. She left a sound and prosperous ranch that her son ran and his son after him. She left a library full of light and long oak tables where the children of a whole county learned that the world was wider than a short grass town. She left a way of keeping books, honest and unflinching, that her daughters carried down to daughters of their own. She left a creek whose water still belonged to the people who lived along it, and not to any man who had ever meant to own them through it. And she left the memory told of an evening for as long as anyone who had known her lived, of the quiet woman who came off the afternoon stage with a leather case held tight against her chest and a secret she was too burned to share, and who learned, slowly, in the lamplight of a failing ranch beside a closed and grieving man, that the case was never the fortune after all, that the fortune was the life, the plain and ordinary and unrepeatable life, the 10,000 small decisions to stay and to work and to trust and to keep going. That was not nothing. In the long and difficult accounting of a life, that was very nearly everything. Out on the rise above the creek, the autumn wind moved through the short grass the way it always had, and down along the water the cattle grazed in the last of the light, and in the spring, as it had every spring for 40 years, and would for 40 more, the green would come back along the banks first of all,